camino en un mismo trazado, uniendo nuestros hombros para así levantar aquellos que cayeron gritando libertad. Arriba la bandera, que todos alzan la vista, probar en una tierra con voz y libertad. Sonarán las campanas, verde los campanarios y los campos desiertos volverán a granar unas espigas altas dispuestas para el pan, para un pan que en los siglos nunca fue repartido entre todos aquellos que hicieron lo posible por empujar la historia hacia la libertad. Egun batia pleno, begirada estatuta, lur bat izango dugu, askatasuna da. También será posible que esa hermosa mañana ni tú, ni yo, ni el otro la lleguemos a ver, pero habrá que empujarla para que pueda ser, sea con viento que arranque los matojos, surgiendo la verdad, que limpie los caminos de siglos de destrozos contra la libertad. Habrá un día en que todos, al levantar la vista, veremos una tierra que ponga libertad. Habrá un día en que todos, al levantar la vista, veremos una tierra que ponga libertad.
Okay, so welcome back. Today we're going to talk about some of the summary from our last class about the different transitions within the Francoist dictatorship from 1939 to 1975. And today's lecture will mostly focus on the transition to democracy itself. I've been playing through a series of images called up simply on internet by looking up the Francoist repression. And we take a look and see that during the 40 years of dictatorship, or nearly 40 years of dictatorship, we see some coherent images of police brutality, infiltration of secret police in everyday life. We also see enforcement of cultural policies such as Castilian speaking only, with the slogan, "Your Spanish speaks Spanish," as well as other policies that include repression of women and also persecution of homosexuality, which is broadly understood to be LGBTQ, or gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and today queer. What is understood to be under Francoism to be simply homosexual, the umbrella term homosexuality. There continued to be political prisoners and prisoners of conscience in assassination of the Francoist resistance, as well as anarchists and so on, as late as the final year of the dictator's life, 1975. Keeping this in mind, we have to understand then that there's a kind of misnomer or false misunderstanding, or false understanding about the notion of a dictatorship that somehow softens up as it progresses, or that turns from, as we say in Spanish, a dictadura, dictatorship, to dicta blanda, or a softening of a dictatorship. This is false. We understand that despite the regime's attempt to stay alive, so to speak, in political relations and in the world relations after the defeat of fascism in World War II. Spain would be forced to court the United States, also faced with financial collapse in its early years, in order to be able to receive foods, rations, and also foodstuffs and financial aid, low interest loans to rebuild Spain. In the form of an assistance package from the United States, first under the Truman administration to the Franco regime, and then later continued by Eisenhower to the Franco regime. This, in other words, brings Spain from the moment of its 1940s policies of autarky and isolationism, which forced Spain into what was known as the years of hunger, los años de hambre, into a new paradigm in which, in order to survive in the 1950s context, in order to survive the defeat of fascism after World War II, Spain must shed some of its international image as a fascist country and supplant some of its discourse on race or even its links to Nazism in favor of finding in the United States a common ally against communism in the New World context. This is the Cold War. And so the United States and Franco would make for strange bedfellows. In other words, the United States, of course, had fought in World War II on the side of the Allied forces to defeat fascism. And then immediately after the war, it finds itself in a position offering specific aid to Spain, or Franco's Spain, in order to rebuild Spain with an interest in having military bases here in Spain. In fact, they still exist in Cádiz, for example, in Rota, as well as in the outskirts of Madrid, the Air Force Base in Torrejón de Ardoz. In other words, the United States, going against the United Nations, which had isolated Spain from any kind of assistance or eligibility for the Marshall Plan because it was a fascist regime, the United States goes against this policy or this world policy and instead approaches Spain out of military and economic interest. This, in a way, supports the regime through the 1950s. In fact, the regime would only end in 1975 with the dictator's death. What were some of the policies then that we see in place with this turning point in the decade of the 1940s associated with hunger, autarky, to the 1950s, a moment of development in Spain emerging into very, from isolationist policies, which it still had, but into very careful relations, international relations with the United States against a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Moving into the 1960s, where we see continued development and economic progress despite the regime's isolationist policies, into the 1970s, which is the transition. Take a moment and put in your notes, or jot down in your notes, what was autarky from the 1940s? And more specifically, how was autarky a tool of political repression from the regime against the Spanish people? I'll have to give you a minute to write that down. Okay. Hopefully pause the video, of course, if you need more time, always. What were some of the mechanisms of repression from the regime? We see that throughout the 40 years of Francoism, there would be a form of censorship, not only of the press, but of all media, including film, literature, and even personal correspondence in the mail. There could be interception of personal correspondence, as well as the regime's own propaganda. The regime would emit or create its own propaganda, first in newsreels, and also in state-controlled media, such as radio and later television, in which autonomous journalism or independent journalism ultimately the contents would be controlled or manipulated by the regime. We also see then that in tightly controlled authoritarian regimes where there's a censorship of information and also the creation or production of the regime's own image in its own media, we see paired with this forms of state violence, ones that we've already been talking about, repression of women, homosexuality broadly, also the forms of concentration camps for political dissidents, as well as assassinations, and also political prisoners held and put on trial for subversive activities against the regime. There were also then practices of torture by the state, whether by police forces or civil guard, and also military personnel, um, and also forms of blacklisting, social blacklisting, or blackballing that would take place. In other words, something similar happened in the United States during the Red Scare in the 1950s, when somebody would be labeled socially or have the stigma of being somehow left-leaning or left-wing or socialist, communist, and therefore they would not be able to hold a job. They could be fired. They might have to leave town. Particularly, there was a so-called cleansing of the Reds, of left-wing people, from different professions, and one of them is Hollywood from the 1950s. In fact, most notably, among others, Charlie Chaplin would end up leaving the United States where he could no longer find work and returning to England and also working in Europe the rest of his life. We also then see that there were forms of coalescing of support for the regime as well. Those professions that had historically been in favor of democracy or in favor of republic or had very strong Republican leaning or democratic aims, or even labor union organizations, those sectors of the population were courted by the regime in a way with housing subsidies and other forms of sustenance that would allow for a minimum either wage or baseline of life, including government-funded housing, particularly at a time when there was a housing crisis at the end of the 40s and the early 1950s. These kinds of initiatives were not only were of course not the violent repression tactics that we see from state violence, but they were the forms of coercion or of co-opting the population to be in favor of a regime that provided in a way. We see, in other words, a top-down form of violence and a bottom-up forms of attempting to co-opt the population. This is how we understand power, that it works from top-down and also bottom-up. And these two mechanisms, or these different policy measures that would create these two mechanisms of coercion and seduction, in a way, or co-option, are what we refer to in Antonio Gramsci's notion or theoretical notion of how hegemony works, how state power works in a hegemonic way, attempting to top-down as well as bottom-up coalesce support for its rule. Okay, with each decade that goes by, 70s, which is where we're going to end today, 1975, and beginning to discuss the transition, we have to understand that there was always opposition to the regime. Students, neighborhood associations, different sectors in the professions, sometimes healthcare workers and so on, had mobilized in different ways. Also labor unions that were underground. They were outlawed, but they were still in existence and were meeting in clandestine ways. We're always plotting, let's say, resistance activities or even organizing protests and taking to the streets, even though they were putting their lives at risk. We see, in other words, that it would be false to think of the regime as an enterprise that operated strictly from a top-down without any kind of challenge or protest or opposition from its people. There were constantly moments of opposition. The song that I played just now is a folk song. It's called A Song to Liberty, which coincides with the 1970s and the late years of the dictator's death and early years of the transition to democracy. When folk song and cultural forms of protest and demonstration become more commonplace, people are taking to the streets. Okay, I would like to discuss then the transition to democracy in a series of events historically and then analyze them. And I'll show you videos interspersed. So first, what I'd like to show you is that at the end of the dictator's life, where the reading picks up for today in Hooper, chapters 1 and 2, the transition, in a way, is hatched in the regime. In 1973, there's an accident, a car bomb explodes. Let me show you. Here we are. I'm going to show you the president of government, Admiral Carrero Blanco, was a military man handpicked by the general Francisco Franco to be his successor. A very frail dictator had chosen him at the end of his life. Was one day on his way to Mass, driving through downtown Salamanca. He always took the same route. And his chauffeur took him down the street, Claudio Coello, and a car bomb went off, blasting the car into the air, where it landed on the other side of a building inside the interior courtyard of a convent. This is a recreation from the movie Operación Ogro, which explores the events of this terrorist attack. This is a faithful recreation to in the film of exactly what happened. The terrorist organization or armed state resistance organization ETA, which is the abbreviation ETA for the Basque Homeland and Freedom Armed State Independence Movement, had rented a property on one side of the street and tunneled or dug a tunnel underneath the street, and packed it with explosives, detonating these explosives from a cable and switch in the distance. This is precisely what we see when the police arrive on the scene, and now what we're about to see is not recreated footage, but actual real footage that was filmed by journalists as soon as they arrived. The police thought it was an accident. The police thought it was an explosion of some kind of a gas line, because there had been an explosion of a gas line in downtown Madrid in the same week, a few days prior. The police then, upon arrival on the scene, don't know where the president's car is. We see effectively, yes, it was a gas explosion.
Los funcionarios del coche de escolta han resultado heridos y estamos tratando de localizar el coche del presidente.
They're trying to locate the car of the president, and effectively it's on the other side of the wall. They would locate it instantly, of course, but it was in that moment when there was the question of ultimately what had happened to the car. So what we see then is that this very violent act, a terrorist act by ETA, was the sort of precipitous event of the transition. Here, an aging dictator, some 80 years of age, had handpicked his military successor and head of state, who is now erased from the equation very violently. The car bomb itself killed both the chauffeur and the president of government, in what ended up being sort of were attributed to the beginning moment of the transition, where the dictator attends the funeral of the man that he's that as an ailing dictator, of somebody that he has chosen to succeed him. In 1975, the dictator passes away of complications from successive surgeries, and the president of government, who we read about today, Arias Navarro, appears on television, state television, and announces the death of the dictator in a very solemn address.
Habla el presidente del gobierno, don Carlos Arias Navarro.
Españoles, Franco ha muerto.
We see that the dictator's body would be put on display in the royal palace in Madrid, where people would attend and pay their respects. We see in particular Franco's sympathizers giving the fascist salute. This is 1975. The body then is taken to the Valley of the Fallen, where it's buried 3 days later. There's a moment of national mourning. We see the Valley of the Fallen in aerial images and inside the basilica. This is young King Juan Carlos I overseeing the burial in 1975. Of course, that casket would remain there until last year, until 2019, with the exhumation from the Valley of the Fallen. Immediately, as Franco had willed it, the monarchy would be restored. In other words, there had already been set in place in the will of the dictator that the national Catholic cause would continue, and with it, the head of state and head of military would be King Juan Carlos. That would restore the monarchy, and then under that monarchy have a rotating president that would be a military figure like Franco himself. In other words, immediately that plan is seen through. The king is sworn in, a very nervous king, before all of the symbols of Francoist rule, which is what we see here in 1975. This is the Congress building in downtown Madrid.
Señor, juráis por Dios y sobre los santos evangelios cumplir y hacer cumplir las leyes fundamentales del reino y guardar lealtad a los principios que informan el movimiento nacional.
The king is required in this instant to swear on a Bible and swear his allegiance to or loyalty to the national Catholic cause in order to continue the will of Franco, but also fascism.
Sobre los santos evangelios, cumplir y hacer cumplir las leyes fundamentales del reino y guardar lealtad a los principios que informan el movimiento nacional.
Si así lo hiciereis, que Dios os lo premie, y si no, que os lo demande. En nombre de las Cortes Españolas y del Consejo del Reino, manifestamos a la nación española que queda proclamado Rey de España, don Juan Carlos de Borbón y Borbón, que reinará con el nombre de Juan Carlos I. Señores procuradores, señores consejeros, desde la emoción en el recuerdo a Franco, ¡viva el rey! ¡Viva! ¡Viva España! ¡Viva!
We notice that is the fascist eagle behind them, and this is today's Congress building.
Todas las miradas se posan en ese instante sobre don Juan Carlos de Borbón, tratando de escrutar sus intenciones políticas para un futuro del que solo se sabe una cosa. Que
Visibly nervous. What I'd like to point out by showing you this video is not only to give you a real sense of the moment, but the uncertainty of the moment too, even for the king. The transition is much bigger than the king. It might be easy to look back and say that somehow King Juan Carlos had a significant role in the transition as head of state and military, as monarch. We understand, though, that in reality, in sociological context, that the transition was made in the streets, that it was the resistance movements and constant resistance to the regime is precisely why democracy was made possible, among other forces, but it was not necessarily a king who was steering this transition into democracy whatsoever. In other words, the social forces were greater than the king. We kind of see this. This is conveyed to us in a way, or it's legible to us in the uncertainty of that expression. It's a very volatile and uncertain moment. Okay, so I'd like to give you an outline then of a few events that take place in the succession of King Juan Carlos's coronation for 1975 and then into in the early years of 1977 until the approval of the Constitution that we have today, the ratification of the Constitution, that 1978, referred to, of course, as the Constitution of 78. In Spain, then, in 1977, begins immediately with a form of electoral process. In order for Spain, though, to host elections, there can no longer be one party. There can no longer be simply one party that is all of the representation in Congress under the Francoist rule. In order for Spain to become a democracy, it must legalize political parties. It must legalize the concept of the right to affiliate to a political party, and that those parties can then have free elections or go up for a free election. It must also, of course, aligning itself with the rest of West Europe in this time, it must engage in some form of, or allow for some form of freedom of the press and also universal suffrage. By 1977, then, we see that the first congresses are elected, and those congresses have, on the one hand, former Francoists and a new right wing that participates in the democratic elections in different parties, in different party formations. But we also see in the same Congress elected socialists, Democrats, and also Republicans, people who were not in favor of a monarchy whatsoever, communists, and so on. Just to jog your memory, why would anarchists not run for political representation? Consider then that in this new Congress, you have on the one side a left wing that was made illegal under Francoism, and it suddenly has representation in Congress. And on the other hand, you have a right wing, which is a variegated right wing, but among them Francoists, who are either right wing and faithful to the national Catholic cause, or they're right wing and they consider themselves to be reformists, which are those who wanted to engage in establishing a new democratic party, or a new party that would right-wing party that would participate in the new democratic system. The founder of one of these parties is a former Francoist. The PP in Spain, the establishment right-wing party that we spoke about or have spoken about in recent classes, was founded by a former Francoist minister, Manuel Fraga. Fraga was Minister of Tourism and Information. Information meaning that he was in charge of censorship of the press and censorship broadly, as well as propaganda of the regime in the 1960s and 70s. In other words, the current right wing, or the establishment right wing, as well as now what we could consider to be the extreme right in Spain, has its origin in the dictatorship. In 1977, we see then, for the first time, a variegated makeup of political representation that had been at odds with each other in the Spanish Civil War. One of the laws that was passed then is the 1977 Amnesty Law. What is amnesty? Do you know what amnesty means? Amnesty means giving pardon for one's crimes or giving pardon for one's sentences or otherwise. And so amnesty law would grant amnesty to all of the war crimes under Francoism. or crimes against humanity, ultimately, committed under Francoism. Okay, now what's wrong with this? The problem with the amnesty law today is that it's not compliant with the world courts. The Hague and international courts have urged Spain more recently to repeal its law of amnesty and try crimes or war crimes and crimes against humanity from the dictatorship. This would mean that Spain has a series of unresolved cases about the war crimes or Francoist repression that has yet to be tried. So we know from the world context, regardless of whether the perpetrators are deceased or alive, all crimes against humanity and all war crimes must be tried. If they're not, then it becomes inconsistent with the question of the international courts, but also it's a question of justice, of international justice, and that justice is never laid to rest or brought to justice ultimately without the trying of crimes against humanity. Spain in 1977 then, by adopting an amnesty law, in one fell swoop, grants amnesty to the perpetrators of war crimes from Francoism. And on the other hand, the political prisoners that were prisoners of conscience in the Francoist resistance are released from jail. They're granted amnesty. We can imagine then that this was a celebrated moment. It was celebrated precisely because those people who probably in a democracy would not have been in jail anyway, people who were simply organizing labor unions or were considered to be political dissidents, organizing protests, and so on, these people who were in jail because of their political beliefs were released from jail. And so it was celebrated as the end of Francoism. But on the other side of the same coin, amnesty was also granted to all of those who had committed some form of war crime. So we see that this is not even. In a democratic state, those who were in jail wouldn't have been. And on the other hand, those who are getting off scot-free in a way without trial or granted amnesty are those perpetrators of war crimes or torturers and so on. In other words, we see that the Spanish case is still unresolved today, and the amnesty law of 1977 is the major keystone to that problem. By 1978, a constitution is drafted by this new Congress and a political representation, and that goes to a popular vote, and it's an overwhelming vote that yes, to adopt the Constitution or ratify the Constitution with King Juan Carlos as head of state. There is no choice. The population is given the Constitution with King Juan Carlos as head of state and head of military, and it's offered to vote yes or no. And of course, an overwhelming percentage of the population votes yes. The Constitution of 1978 is adopted, and Spain is celebrated ultimately as a kind of success story or model that would be exported to other countries exiting authoritarian regimes, whether that would be later with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, or it would be, say, the disintegration of right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America, as was the case with the Franco's dictatorship as a right-wing military dictatorship too. I would like to then, this is a little bit later. There we are. I'd like to show you one more video. In 1981, there's a crisis of democracy. In 1981, military generals from the Civil Guard, among them a man who appears in the reading for today, Tejero and his followers would storm the Congress building in downtown Madrid and take the Congress hostage for one night. This is what we refer to as 23F, the 23rd of February, 1981, a very long night where there was a standoff between military forces who had taken Congress hostage and the king, who appears on television in defense of democracy. Let's watch those incidents now. Before we do, we're going to see that gunshots were fired inside the Congress building. They were fired in the air. At that time, we didn't know, of course, if anyone was injured or even killed. But it would only be a few moments later when that could be, found out. Looking back in retrospect, however, we know that nobody was injured or killed really from the gunshots that we're about to hear. This is Tejero, and the president of government comes up and says, "What are you doing?" And shots are fired in the air. Physical altercation of what's about the one of the representatives of the right wing. This military general, or rather civil guard, lieutenant colonels of the civil guard, they're attempting to return Spain to a national Catholic rule, a military rule as Franco had willed it. In other words, they're trying to return Spain by force, by military force, to a military state as Franco had willed it. Here we see the king then practicing and then ultimately appearing live on TV to the king's speech, where comes out in defense of democracy in 1981.
Confirmo que he ordenado a las autoridades civiles y a la Junta de Jefes de Estado Mayor que tomen todas las medidas necesarias para mantener el orden constitucional dentro de la legalidad vigente.
Parece que se han fijado en la cámara.
And we see then that the Congress building was evacuated. The coup fails, or the attempt to overthrow democratically elected parliament fails. The perpetrators are arrested and their supporters, and then there's a mass demonstration in the streets by the people in favor of democracy. It's at this moment where mass popular support is consolidated in favor of King Juan Carlos's rule, and that's what we see here, is that people are holding a sign that says, "Long live the king, viva el rey." Even the leader of the Communist Party, who, as you know and have studied, the communists historically were Republican. They were in favor of a republic without a monarchy. Even they, or their leader, Santiago Carrillo, would come out in a public statement and say, "We are not monarchists, but today we are all Juan Carlistas." Okay. So, oops. I guess I see, that's why. Okay. So getting back to a couple of things then here. What were some of the steering forces of the transition then? This is sort of consolidates the transition. Is this crisis of democracy, the potential return to a military rule, and then the failure of that, and the following elections then go to a socialist party by a landslide. In other words, a party that had been formerly outlawed under the regime and who was in exile, and those who formed part of this political organization were subject to political repression too. So how is it then that what forces are at play in creating a rather swift transition into a democratic state? Well, we see that on the one hand, there was a very healthy middle class. In other words, that we have a very significant part of the population had seen their ways of life get better from the years of hunger, of course, to a generation later in the years of development by the late 50s and 60s. In other words, by the time of the transition, there is a solid middle class that had been formed to act as a stabilizing force during the time of the transition. This is what Alex Longhurst refers to as mesocratization. Mesocratization, like meso, in other words, that if you look at the distribution of wealth, some 70 to 80% of the classes are within the middle range, within the middle classes, which is quite astounding. In other words, whenever we have great wealth inequality in a given circumstance at a given time, it means that there's a more likelihood for revolution. That doesn't necessarily guarantee revolution, but it certainly can be one of the conditions for revolution. Can you imagine then why, if people are living a better lifestyle, why it is that they would not engage in revolution, or why would this be a stabilizing force, so to speak? Well, we see this because ultimately people are willing to lose less, or they're willing to risk less if they have a more comfortable middle class lifestyle. This ultimately serves as a kind of stabilizing force during the time of the transition. Another force is psychological. There is a fear and a remembrance of the past. The Spanish Civil War had taken place some 40 years prior, and the brutal repression of the dictatorship and years of hunger is some 30 years prior. In other words, we see that there is a very clear remembrance that weighs upon the present of the transition. And so although people are actively taking to the streets, there's also a will for this kind of protest to be a pacific or a peaceful one, more or less. There's also a fear of terrorism. Keep in mind that the president of government, handpicked by Francoism, had been erased from the equation instantly by a very violent event, as we saw, this car bomb that explodes. And we also see then, too, that there were political and economic forces acting within Spain and outside of Spain. One of those clearly is Western Europe and the United States. Western Europe that is interested in seeing Spain transition into a free market democracy and engage in trade, in a kind of free market trade and investment that it hadn't done up until then, that it hadn't been prepared to do given the isolationist policies of the regime. And then also the United States, which is interested in the same, but is also particularly interested in the military bases in Spain that we mentioned before. And this is why Henry Kissinger would be in Spain during the 1970s to negotiate with Juan Carlos a steering of the regime that could keep United States military presence here. That's the case today. As I said before, though, the most important force is the visible character of protests that were taking place in the streets. Had there not been a presence of people in the streets, there would not clearly have been or of different groups vying for rights, despite the fact that they're faced with violence from the police, torture, disappearances, and so on, and significant repression. There would not have been a clear public image or a consensus around the fact that there would need to be a democracy despite governors' wishes, or even Franco's own will and testament. This is what I mean when I say that the transition was bigger than the king, or bigger than any one person. Okay, so to end with this then, I would like to show you that this is much in the United States popular culture, reaches us in Saturday Night Live and Chevy Chase's running shtick on the nightly news. General Franco is still dead. And so let's watch this. It's a series of compendium of the number of times that he would mention this in the nightly news. It's also, of course, a humorous way of addressing censorship and recognizing censorship of the regime outside of Spain.
Churchill Downs today reported that it has accepted an entry by Ruffian, the late filly, who is now a 3-year-old and finally eligible to run. Insiders believe she will be ridden by jockey Francisco Franco, who, it is said, is finally down to racing weight. Well, time is running out for Generalissimo Francisco Franco. The Spanish dictator has now held his breath since November 1975. but he still has a long way to go to beat the existing world's record held by his predecessor, Tomás de Torquemada, who has been holding his breath since 1498. Charlie Chaplin's classic comedy film, The Great Dictator, was finally released in Spain this week. The film had been banned during the 40-year reign of Generalissimo Francisco Franco because it made fun of Franco's friend, Adolf Hitler. Hitler could not be reached for comment in Argentina, and sources report that Franco now only watches underground movies. In Spain, new problems for Generalissimo Francisco Franco. His personal doctors have gone on strike, and until they return to duty, no one can guarantee how long the dead dictator can remain in his present condition. And our final story tonight took place today in Montreal, where Generalissimo Francisco Franco scored a perfect 10 out of 10 in the cadaver diving, a relatively new sport in Olympic competition. The former ruler of Spain, now known as El Cadaver, scored an upset over Daniel Gerhardt, ex-mercenary, who was considered to be the favorite until he lost points for his execution. Generalissimo Francisco Franco has spent a restful summer in Spain, plans to remain there for the fall and possibly the winter.
Okay, we get the picture, but ultimately wanted to call this to your attention simply that there was, of course, skepticism and in humor, represented here in humor, but skepticism about the censorship of the press and the issuing of propaganda from the regime because of the regime's silences and its manipulations, but also because of the countless examples that we have of how press images were censored in Spain, but then leaked to the international press, or that within Spain, for instance, certain terrorist attacks were tried to be pinned on specific perpetrators who happened to be in jail in these really absurd ways, who were political dissidents in Spain, in the Spanish case. But that ultimately there were other people responsible for them, who such as ETA and so on. In other words, we see that this kind of speculation about the regime discredited the regime internationally, and this is what we find even in Saturday Night Live humor. We're going to end here today. Today's charla conference is much more informative to fill in some of the gaps. I wanted to sum up one final point of things that we're going to continue talking about in the future. What did the dictatorship, or the transition to democracy from dictatorship, what did it not do? Even though it is celebrated as an exemplary model and has been exported to other countries, like I mentioned before, like Hungary, Argentina, and so on, how is it that Spain's transition to democracy is flawed? We understand, on the one hand, that in the time of the transition, it did not introduce a collective reflection about the atrocities of dictatorship, or about the Francoist repression, or the experience of war. Those stories instead were pushed into family narratives. In other words, they did not have a public expression that went hand in hand with the time of the transition. In other words, it did not induce a collective reflection about democratic values, nor about what the Francoist repression was. And so the regime simply went from a state rule that had been manufactured so that the citizens do not participate in the state rule, to a transition into democracy in which there was not necessarily a reflection about what values make a given state democratic, nor what values or practices make a given state, such as the dictatorship and authoritarian regime. What was fascism here? We also see that, and this is point number 2, there was not a break with state oversight of the media. In other words, even during the time of the transition and into the 1980s and 90s, we see that there was a form of state oversight and even attempt to manipulate in the independence or freedom of the press. That's something that's an argument made by Alicia Gomez Montano. Next, I wanted to point out that we see that the the mass fortunes, or the fortunes and powerful forms of influence and political influence that had been amassed under the regime by Francoist sympathizers, that was not dismantled during the time of democracy. They haven't been dismantled today. We see, for example, that the Franco family itself has great tracts of land and cultural value of countless wealth that it accrued due to the political repression and also confiscation of property and wealth and so on. And yet this is something that's it goes questioned, but nothing is quite done about it. So the democracy did not dismantle the amassing of fortunes or ultimately political power that was wielded by Francoists through the time of the transition. We also see that textbooks today don't necessarily address it beyond a very factual-based case. What I mean to say is that by now you've read about what it was like for women who wanted to go to university and the kinds of political repression that they suffered in order to do so during the time of the regime. We've also studied the fact that there was concentration camp labor. We've also studied that there were mass graves and the political repression that are still unresolved. These questions aren't necessarily part of textbooks. They're not necessarily part of a national conversation about what the dictatorship was. The dictatorship instead, in the way it's taught in a national curricula, changes from time to time. We can take a look at it online. It changes, of course, from context to context in terms of world history or Spanish history and at what level, primary, secondary education, and so on. But up until recently, for instance, the history of the transition did not form part of an obligatory college curriculum for political science students, to give an example. And then finally, we see that most importantly, ultimately, that the traumas of the past, in a way, much like the Holocaust, remain open and unresolved. In other words, the question of how that violence could come to pass, the question of how that violence ensued, is one that continues to resound and remain important today. It's one that continues to sting. It's one that, in a way, that must be understood in order to prevent the return of an extreme right. And yet today we're also faced with the rise of an extreme right that draws from, or drinks from in a way, in an unabashed way, from some of the Francoist discourse and forms of political repression or allusions to them, as well as the repurposing of history or redesigning of certain manipulation of historical events seen through the lens of fascism, or through a nationalist discourse or a discourse on race, through sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and so on, and that these questions aren't necessarily part of a discussion about what fascism was here. In other words, it continues to be relevant. All of these things put together in a picture, we see that the transition was in many ways insufficient, even though it was celebrated in its day because the violence of the Civil War didn't break out. And because Spain ultimately could maintain its political relations with the United States, its military bases here, but also to enter into free trade regimes. So if we look at, say, finance, military interest, United States political interest as well, we see then that, well, perhaps it could be seen as a success story. But if we look at how it also has swept certain problems under the rug, or hasn't addressed them in an adequate way, or that continues to be unresolved in what we could understand to be the return of right-wing groups and ideologies today, then we see it as a relevant problem and also flawed. That's where we'll end today, today's lecture, in this more informative than anything lecture that will piece together the reading by Hooper. In our next class, we're going to be discussing the movida, which is the cultural expression of the consolidation of democracy in the 1980s. We'll take a look at music videos. We'll take a look at photography from the 80s, and also new expressions of identity that are coming about in democratic Spain. We're also going to be taking a look at what some could refer to as the reduced version of the movida as sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the 1980s. Thanks very much, and have a good day. I will see you soon.